Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to P&P Live at Lunch. I am Heidi Lewis, the Director of Corporate Events and Sales for Politics and Prose Bookstore in Washington, D.C. And as part of our ongoing effort to engage our community from afar, we're now offering midday events like this one, in addition to our regular evening lineup. Thank you all so much for being here today. Our distinguished guest this afternoon needs no introduction. He is one of the best-known living economists and most influential global voices in the fight against inequality. Thomas Piketty is here to discuss his eye-opening and audacious new book, Capital and Ideology. He's joined by Stephanie Kelton, former chief economist on the U.S. Senate Budget Committee and professor of economics and public policy at Stony Brook University. Her new book, The Deficit Myth, is on sale June 9th and available now for pre-order. Just a few housekeeping things to note before we get started. We want to hear from you. Just as he would in an in-person event, Thomas will answer your questions after his talk. How does that work? Look at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a button that says Ask a Question. Please use this space to pose your questions about capital and ideology. You can also upvote someone else's question if you find something there that you really hope Thomas will address. He will be joined on screen by Dr. Kelton following his talk, who will be reading from your questions and asking some of her own. And a reminder that unlike our in-person events, the author, host, and audience members cannot see you through the screen. And now, please join me in welcoming Thomas Piketty.
Hello to you all, and let me first say, that of course I would have much preferred to be there in person. We had scheduled an event at Politics and Prose, I think exactly today, a couple of months ago, and because of the lockdown, because of the pandemics, of course I am locked down in Paris, so I'm not able to be there in person. I'm going to say a few words about my new book, Capital and Ideology, and then I will be very happy to answer questions. But before I start, let me just say how strange it is, to be talking today about this book in this context of this pandemics. And let me say simply in a few words that what these terrible events illustrate to me. First of all, is really the violence of inequality, in the sense that with the pandemic and with the lockdown, we see in a very crude manner, the inequality between people who are locked down in a nice apartment, who have income support, people like me who are in Paris, and people who are in a very small home, or sometimes homeless people, and people who don't have adequate income support, and this happens including in developed countries where unemployment benefit system and income support system are such that many workers actually don't have proper access to this income transfer mechanism. And I can see in the streets of Paris people who are going to get some money to keep working on delivery jobs on their bicycle, and in the southern hemisphere, in poor countries, that's of course even worse than the lockdown. In practice, in countries like India, West Africa, meant in many cases pushing out of cities a large number of rural workers or migrant workers who were working in construction site or other work in the city, and which in some cases were pushed out in sometimes violent manners, and there was sort of mass displacement of people going back to the countryside because of that, which, it's not clear at all that it is good for the pandemics. And more generally, what this crisis illustrates, I think, is that, we need to develop systems of safety net and income support. We need, of course, more investment in our public health systems. That's pretty obvious. But all the income support system and the safety net that is really lacking, especially in poor countries in the southern hemisphere, is something that's really very worrying. And nobody knows how this is going to turn out. This is a completely unprecedented episode. The only historical experience which looks a little bit like this will be the Spanish flu in 1918, 1919. And what we know from this episode is that, 50 million people in the world died, which, hopefully is not going to happen this time because of the lockdown and because of better health policies. But what we know also from this experience is that mortality was much, much larger in poor countries. In the US or in Europe, the mortality rate during the Spanish flu of 1918, 1919 was 0.5 to 1% of the population, which is, of course, already enormous. If you apply that to total population in the US or Europe, you get frightening numbers. But in India, mortality rate was over 5%, and in Indonesia, over 3%, in South Africa, over 3%, and scholars working with historical mortality data long after the episode have demonstrated this huge inequality with respect to the pandemics. And so, today, what we have is really a terrible crisis. The absolutely top priority is to do everything we can to keep the casualties as low as possible. This requires more solidarity at the national, at the international level. And in the longer run, of course, this requires, and this could lead us to transform parts of how our economic system is organized. And so, which brings me to my book, Capital and Ideology, which is really a book where I show how, crisis, social crisis, financial crisis, but it can be a pandemic like this one, contribute in history to change dominant ideologies and dominant views about the economy is organized. But something I learned also from my book, Capital and Ideology, is that, crises in themselves, sometimes are necessary to trigger change, but they are never, they are not sufficient in themselves to trigger the right kind of change. It all depends on popular mobilization. It all depends on political and social mobilization in order to get the right trajectory after the crisis. So let me. I'm sure we'll have opportunities to talk more about this in the question time in a few minutes. Let me step back a little bit and try to describe to you the content of my new book, Capital and Ideology. So first of all, I should apologize. I should apologize first for the fact that my English sounds so much like French. I hope you can understand me, and I'm really sorry that I'm so bad with my pronunciation of English. I'm also sorry for the fact that my book is so long. I'm aware, I wanted to write a book of reasonable length, and I must say that this one has really gotten out of control and has become much bigger than what I expected initially. At the same time, I should stress that this is a very readable book. This is not a technical book at all. I think this can be read by anyone who is interested in the history of human societies. It does not require any technical economic knowledge in any kind. I think this is a better book than my previous book, Capital in the 21st Century, for a number of reasons. The first reason is that I take a much broader and global perspective on the history of inequality. So my previous book, Capital in the 21st Century, had many limitations. Probably one of the main limitations was that it was too much Western-centered, partly because of data availability reason, but also because of the limitation of my own thinking about inequality regime. So in this new book, I talk much more about countries outside the West, about India, about Brazil, about South Africa, about China, about Haiti, and this much broader perspective also has implication for the way I have come to see the history of inequality regime. And to put it in a nutshell, by broadening the perspective, by looking at more and more historical episodes of historical change in the level and structure of inequality across human societies, I have come to the conclusion that the primary determinant of inequality in societies is really political and ideological rather than economic or technological. So what I mean by this is that if you look at different countries over time, you see very fast change in the way we organize the economy, in the way we structure social inequality between class, and this always happens, at times where we don't necessarily plan it will happen. But what's very striking is that it happens always much faster than what typically the elite in every society, tend to naturalize inequality. So that is to describe inequality as being natural, as the current level of inequality is the only possible one, and if we try to change anything, the world is going to crash or something like this. But in fact, the entire history of inequality that I describe in my book shows the opposite. We have very fast changes. Sometimes it happens after big crash, including wars or revolution or pandemics, but sometimes it also happens in more peaceful manner. And I give examples like this in the book. One example is the case of Sweden, which I think is pretty interesting, because sometimes today, including in my country, in France, people look at Sweden as if, they had a sort of permanent culture of equality. And in a way, sometimes it's also put as an excuse, typically in my country, in France, to say, oh, we cannot be like Swedes because, this is their culture, we will not tolerate it, and in fact, they are too much into equality, and this has always been the Swedish culture, there's nothing we can do about that. But when you look at history, in fact, it's completely wrong. In fact, for a very long time, Sweden was an incredibly unequal country, and in particular at the beginning of the 20th century, so just 1 century ago until 1911, in particular between 1865 and 1911, Sweden had one of the most unequal voting system in the whole of Europe. So in the 19th century, it was very common in Europe, but also in other parts of the world, to have voting rights limited to property owners. But in the case of Sweden, they went much further than this, because they decided that within property owners, so basically within the top 20% of the population, you would have between 1 and 100 votes, depending on the size of your property and the tax you pay. And in municipal elections, there was no upper limit, so you could have more than 100 votes, so that you had several dozen municipalities where one individual had more than 50% of the vote, so in effect was a dictator, but from a perfectly legal viewpoint. This included the Prime Minister of Sweden at the time, who was an aristocrat, like all Prime Ministers at the time. So if someone had told Swedes in 1910, you're going to become a very equal country, people would have said, well, look, that's not the plan. Except that, there was a very large social mobilization, in particular by trade union and workers, industrial workers, which were relatively educated for the time in Sweden, and who clearly believe that the property elite had gone a little bit too far in constitutionalizing their advantage. They imposed universal suffrage. They took control of the state. The Social Democrats took control of the government after the election of 1932, stayed in power almost for 60 years without interruption, or with very short interruption, and they were able to put the state capacity of Sweden to the service of a completely different objective. Today, it's different. Sweden since the 1990s is following a different trajectory, partly because they feel very small as compared to world financial market and world capitalism, and also maybe because some people have believed that now it is so much in the culture that they can stop a number of policies. But maybe this is a mistake. But what I want to draw as a lesson from this experience is that there's no culture of equality or culture of inequality. The idea is that Sweden as a permanent culture of inequality, or that India, for instance, would have a permanent culture of inequality, and Sweden a permanent culture of equality. I think this is the kind of cultural stereotypes which we have to forget completely. What matters in the end in history is social and political mobilization. In the case of Sweden, it didn't take World War I and World War II did not play a major role in Sweden, so it was relatively peaceful social and political mobilization. In other cases, it takes very big crises to shift the balance of power. But the optimistic message that I'm really trying to push in the book is that it's more complicated than just a pure, crude, physical, material balance of power. It's also a process of learning and a process of intellectual balance of power. And I think it will be a big mistake, in particular, to imagine that we sort of know how to reduce inequality, we know what to do, we know how to solve every problem, and the only problem is a pure balance of power with some bad people who don't want this to happen. And I'm not saying that there's no bad people around who protect their position and the status quo. Of course, there's always been this in history, but I think we have to take seriously the issue of how we reorganize globalization today, how we organize an educational system at the age of higher education, how we reorganize the tax system also at the end of at the age of capital flow, how we reorganize the system of flow of goods, services, and capital itself with binding constraints so as to have a more equitable and a more sustainable development model. These are complicated challenges, just like the other challenges that have been addressed by other societies in the past, and we have to take seriously the sort of the intellectual nature of these challenges. And that's the focus of this book, on the history of ideology and intellectual attempts to justify and to organize inequality. And I really want to stress that these systems of justification of inequality are always more complex than just a pure veil in order to justify the domination of always the same groups. I think there is no society in the world where the elite will just say, okay, I'm rich, you're poor, and that's it. The elite will always have a much more sophisticated discourse, for instance, saying, I'm rich, you're poor, but in fact, this is in your interest that I am richer than you so that I can bring more innovation, or in ancient societies, I can bring law and order as the nobility class, or I can give spiritual guidance as the religious class. And I want to stress that these systems of justification, although sometimes they are, of course, a bit hypocritical, and the elite sometimes tend to go a bit too far in trying to justify any kind of advantage for themselves, it's always more subtle than this. It always contains at least some plausibility and some ingredients of truth and plausibility. And we have to take seriously, and I try in this book to take seriously every ideology, even those which today, like, colonial ideologies, or, ideologies protecting extremely high levels of inequality and power and domination. I think we have to take them seriously, just like we have to take seriously today's ideology if we want to be able to think about the future and the transformation of this ideological regime. So regarding the future, let me summarize a little bit the ideal system of which I call participatory socialism, and that I describe at the end of my book. So I'm aware that some people, particularly in this country, in the US, have a problem with socialism. So, if you want to call it social democracy for the 21st century, that's okay with me. I tend to prefer participatory socialism, otherwise I would not have picked this word, but I'm not here to say people what kind of words they should use. What matters is the content. And so the content of the system of participatory socialism that I describe at the end of my book is basically trying to push further what has been successful in the 20th century. This includes, in particular, two complementary approach to the transformation of property relation. One is to give more powers to workers through the legal system. So, for instance, in Germany and Sweden, workers have up to 50% of voting rights in the board of companies, and this has been like that since the 1950s. And I think, by and large, this has been a big success, and we could actually go further than this. We could first extend it to every country. We could extend it to smaller companies. We could also imagine that on the other 50% of voting rights going to shareholders, you have a maximum fraction of voting rights going to a single individual. So in a very large company, maybe it should be not more than 10% to a single shareholder. The general idea is that, you know, we live in very educated society and we need everybody to take part to the economic governance. And one of the lessons from the countries like Sweden and Germany where this system has been applied is that this actually allows to involve workers in the long run investment strategy of their company in a better way. This is also a way to calm down a little bit the top executive about their compensation package, about sometimes their speculative strategies, and, you know, having people on board with a modest and middle income and sort of more down to earth about what the company is really doing in the long run, rather sometimes than focusing on the you know, short run speculative behavior, is actually good. And the experience is that, again, this has worked pretty well. So, you know, of course, shareholders don't like that. You know, I can tell you in my country, where this has never been extended. This system has never been extended to the US, but it has never been extended to Britain, it has never been extended to France, so it has remained a sort of Central European, North European pattern. There is some discussion, there's been some discussion lately in the US, in Britain, in France to extend this, and I think if this was extended by some of these countries or by other countries in the world, in India or in Brazil, you know, this could become a sort of world global model. Again, shareholders don't like this. You know, in my country, shareholders tend to say, oh no, we don't want to have workers on board. You know, workers should demonstrate in the street, but, you know, we don't want to show them our books. We don't want to have them have voting rights in our big decision. But, you know, for a number of years now, people have told the shareholders in France, well, look, you know, this is what they do in Germany and Sweden, and it doesn't seem to be working so badly. So why don't you reconsider? And I think, you know, this is going to change in the coming years. So that's the number, sort of one of the key solutions to transform the very notion of property and property relation. The other dimension is through progressive taxation of wealth and inheritance, which can also be a powerful way to limit the concentration of economic power at the top of the distribution. And this can also help finance, you know, the system of social security, of social spending, including health, education. We see today how much health spendings are important. This also includes more educational justice, which is an area where, you know, there's been a lot of hypocrisy with what I describe in my book as the rise of the Brahmin left and how the Democratic Party in the US and the Social Democratic Party in Europe have lost contact with lower socioeconomic groups, partly because the kind of egalitarian educational platforms that they had in the 50s, 60s, 70s today has sort of disappeared, and with the age of higher education, these parties have become more and more the parties of the winners of the education game and the high graduate individual, and I think this is an area where you know, the more equitable tax system with progressive taxation of wealth, inheritance, income could help fund more educational justice and also universal capital endowment, so as to equalize a little bit the distribution of wealth, which is extremely unequal. You know, in the United States, the bottom 50% of the distribution of wealth owns less than 2% of total wealth. It used to be 3 to 4% 20 years ago, which was already very small. This has gotten even smaller, as my friends Gabriel Zucman and Emmanuel Saez have shown. And you know, so is this the best we can do? You know, 2% of wealth for the bottom 50%? Are we going to wait for market forces, you know, to deliver better outcomes? You know, we've been waiting for a pretty long time now. So, you know, it suggests that we need to rethink this economic system in order to have a more equitable and more sustainable development model. This is also absolutely necessary if we want to address environmental challenges through a system of what I describe in my book as a carbon cart, where you will, on the basis of individual carbon emission, in effect, put very strong disincentives on large carbon emissions. If you have a proportional carbon tax system treating in the same way, low levels of carbon emission and very high levels of carbon emission, you're running into a big problem of with a strong feeling of social injustice, and we've seen that with the Yellow Vest movement in France, but we've seen that also in other emerging countries that have tried to develop this kind of policy. So it's only by combining justice, equality, with a new kind of environmental policies that we will be able to address this global warming challenge. So let me stop there so that we have time for questions. Let me re-emphasize as a final conclusion and last statement that this is an optimistic book in the sense that what I describe in the book is a process of learning about justice. In the long run, I think we are moving in the right direction. I know it can seem strange to say that today, but if you look at the very long run evolution, there's a process of reduction of inequality. This process towards more equality has been very successful. This has come with more equal access to education and health during the 20th centuries and in all the previous centuries. This long-run process toward more equality has been interrupted in the 1980s, 1990s for various ideological reasons, the failure of communism, Reaganism, all sorts of reasons. I think since the 2008 financial crisis and maybe after this 2020 pandemics, more and more people, including conservative people, will accept to reopen the discussion about how to change the economic system and continue this long-run evolution toward more equality. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I'm looking forward for the discussion.
Terrific. I love talking about ideology, because ideology is something that is created really through language, right? And we shape public opinion, and that becomes the dominant ideology. And there at the very end, you mentioned Ronald Reagan. And a word that you didn't use in your talk, at least if you did, it escaped me, is the word neoliberal or neoliberalism. And I wondered whether, in your view, neoliberalism is the dominant political ideology today. And if it is, would you talk about it a little bit? And does it really originate in some sense with Margaret Thatcher, with Ronald Reagan, this idea that, as Reagan said, the government is not the solution to your problem, the government is your problem? And is that sort of where we are today with that, the legacy and that dominant ideology?
This certainly played a very big role. The rise of Reaganism and Thatcherism is very important. In terms of how I describe this ideology, I try in my book to introduce the notion of proprietarianism and neo-proprietarianism, by which I want to stress the fact that these ideologies have a tendency to sacralize property, and basically any level of concentration of wealth is acceptable wherever it comes from. And I try to show that in the 19th century, this ideology of property led to very extreme attitudes, like, for instance, compensation to former owners of slaves rather than compensation to slaves, because people were sacralizing private property so much that they could not imagine put an end to slavery without compensating slave owners. And today it's a different context, but when you see the kind of sacralization of private property, including when it takes the form of property over natural resources, which we know should stay in the ground, or property of public knowledge, which very often was financed by public investment. So it's not the issue of slavery anymore, but there are other issues of how far you sacralize property rights. So that's why in my book I try to introduce this word of proprietarianism, which I agree is a bit complicated, and maybe neoliberalism is a simpler way to describe that. The reason, maybe I will at the end up using neoliberalism. The reason I've been a bit resistant until recently is that, as you know, the term liberal and liberalism has a very different meaning in different countries, and in the US it is used to refer to the left side of the political spectrum. So people who are aware of that neoliberalism describe something very different from liberal people in the usual US political sense, manage to cope with that, but I think some people get completely lost, and so anyway, I'm not anti-sure, but these words of course are very important. In any case, I fully agree with you that the rise of Reaganism and Thatcherism is still one of the defining issues of our time, and the tax reform of 1986 in the US with basically a huge decline in tax progressivity is still something that has never been completely reversed, and in particular the Democratic Party in the US, until now, is still reluctant to reconsider this legacy, and this is what was so new in a way with what Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders proposed during this campaign, which was the creation of a federal wealth tax. Federal income tax was created in 1913 in the US, federal inheritance tax, estate tax in 1916, but there's never been federal wealth tax. So it meant a return to a policy of reduction in inequality in order to fund public universities, and I think this was a major change. But we still, of course, don't know what's going to happen in the coming years. I think at the world level, the rise of Reaganism and Thatcherism, of course, was very important, but maybe the fall of communism, was even more important. And what I show in my book is, in Russia today or in China, these post-communist countries have become, in a way, the best allies of hyper-capitalism. In Russia, in Putin's Russia, you have no progressive income tax at all. The income tax is 13%, 1/3, whether your income is 100 rubles per month or 1 billion rubles per month. So, in the US, maybe Donald Trump dreams about doing something like this, but he cannot say it. In the US, at least, or in Europe, you have to pretend that the tax system is at least a bit progressive, say 5% for bottom incomes and 25-30% for higher incomes. But in Putin's Russia, it's just completely flat. There's no inheritance tax at all in Putin's Russia, or actually in China. So, you privatize everything there is to privatize, very often to the benefit of people who are very close to the regime. Mm-hmm. And then, they can transmit everything with 0% tax. And this is what happened, in countries that used to be communist or pretended to be communist. And so, this kind of big ideological shift, Hong Kong, which is a country we talked about a lot recently, is an amazing example of a country that has become even more unequal and that has actually repealed its inheritance tax after becoming communist. In 2007, they repealed their inheritance tax, well, at least after joining a country that is ruled by the Communist Party of China. And today, if you die in Asia and you want to transmit a large fortune, in case some people in the audience have to make that kind of decision, you should go and die in People's Republic of China, where you have no inheritance tax, because if you go in capitalist Taiwan, or in capitalist South Korea, or in capitalist Japan, you will pay 50% in inheritance tax, and in Japan it was even raised to 55% a couple of years ago by a center-right government. It's not that in Japan they are very lefty. So the fact that Russia and China today, have a complete opacity about ownership with extensive use of tax haven, no transparency at all, no attempt to reduce inequality, shows you, I think, this big ideological shift that happened after the end of communism. That's not due so much to Reaganism or Thatcherism, which was more important in the West, but in many other parts of the world, the failure of communism. And okay, so now it's 30 years after the failure of the Soviet Union. We're in 2020, not in 1990, and I think 30 years later, it's really time to reconsider the fact that we've gone too far into hyper-capitalism and to rethink again about a different economic model.
We're economists, and so as economists, when we think about inequality, we hear this term about the Gini coefficient. Now, that's not a term that's familiar to people, the average person walking around, but would you talk a little bit about how much inequality, because we watch this measure of inequality, I mentioned we call it the Gini coefficient. And do you have a sense of where you would like to see the Gini coefficient move? I know directionally, but how far? Keynes, for example, in the general theory, talks about inequality. And he says, I'm not interested in trying to produce a perfectly egalitarian society. But at the time, Keynes said the degree of income and wealth inequality that we have today, now he's writing, of course, during the Great Depression, is too extreme. So we agree that we have too much income and wealth inequality. How much is too little, in a sense? In other words, I want to get a sense from you how much you'd like to drive inequality down before doing the kinds of things that people would warn about, stifling innovation and that sort of thing. So how much inequality is sort of, in a sense, optimal?
Right, so this is what societies try to learn about throughout their history, and I would not, I'm not going to put an end to this quest, and I don't have a perfect mathematical formula for that. But let me try to answer as precisely as possible. First, in my thinking about inequality, I try to emphasize the concrete groups, like the bottom 10% in society, or the bottom 50% in society, or the top 10%. So, and I try to be explicit about what it means in terms of actual numbers of income level, wealth level, so that people can realize, what it means for themselves, where they are in the distribution, and how, because the problem with the Gini coefficient is that, it tries to synthesize everything that's happening in the distribution from bottom to top into one number. And in the end, it's pretty abstract and people don't really understand where the action is coming from. So to give you an example, if we're thinking about the concentration of wealth. So, wealth as opposed to income. So income is what you earn during a given year. Wealth is what you own. It can be real estate. It can be a stock market portfolio. It can be a business. So this is what you own net of your debt. Okay, so some people have negative wealth if they only have debt. Some people have a lot of wealth, are billionaires. If you look at the distribution of wealth today in the United States, the bottom 50% of the population basically has no wealth at all. As I was saying before, they own 2% of total wealth, whereas the top 10% will own 70%, and the top 1%, almost 40%. At the time of Keynes, in Europe, it was actually even more than that. The top 10% in Britain in the 1920s or in 1900 or 1910, the top 10% would own up to 90% of total wealth, so even more than the 70% in the US today. So over the course of the 20th century, there has been some decline in wealth inequality. The share going basically to the top 10 has been reduced from, say, 90% to 60, 70%, which is a decline, but at the same time, this is a decline of limited magnitude, especially from the point of view of the bottom 50%. So basically, the bottom 50%, they had 0% at the beginning of the century, or 2% or 1% of total wealth, and today they have 2% or 3% in the US. In Europe, they would have a bit more, they would have 4 or 5%. So this is a bit more, but when you have 50% of the population, so in concrete terms, what does it mean? Average wealth today in the US or in Europe will be roughly around, say, $200 per adult. So if you are a couple, it will be 400, maybe a bit more, 250, and for a couple it will be 500. But the median is only 100. So the median is less than the average because you have people at the top who sort of take the average towards the top, but at the bottom, when you have, if you are 50% of the population, and you have only 2% of total wealth, what does it mean? It means that on average, your wealth is 1/25 of average wealth. So if average wealth is $200,000, basically it means you have less than $10,000. So it means you have basically nothing at all. You know, you have a few months in advance on your checking account. Maybe you're trying to buy a home, but at this stage you have a big mortgage, and so your net wealth, you know, so maybe you have an apartment or a home, house worth $300,000, but you have a mortgage of $290,000, so that in fact your net wealth is only $10,000. So this is what the bottom 50% looks like. And what I would like, you know, in the system of participatory socialism that I described, let's say that the share of wealth going to the bottom 50% will at least be at least 20 or 25%. So it will not be 50%, you know, which will be complete equality, but as compared to the 2 or 3% we have today, you know, it would make a big difference. Basically, people would have, you know, $100,000 or instead of having 500. Or they would have, say, between 100 and 200. Now, why is this so important? You know, people who have millions may say, oh, you know, it does not matter, you know, that you have $200,000 or zero. But in fact, it makes a huge difference because, you know, when you have zero or when you only have debt, basically, well, in a situation like today, like the pandemic you have today, you know, you can see the difference it makes because basically you have to go and work because you need to eat. But more generally, you know, when you have no wealth at all, or you only have debt, basically you have to accept anything. You have to take any job, any wage, because, you know, you have to pay your bills. And so you have a very weak bargaining position vis-a-vis the world in general and vis-a-vis your life. So it's more than just money, you know, it's more than just should we have a wealth share of 2% or 20%. You know, what matters is do you own sufficiently that you can, you know, you can be a bit picky. You know, you don't need to accept everything. You can also decide to create a small business if you want. You can buy your home so that then you can take more risk in your professional career because you know that you will have a home. It actually makes a big difference. And I think if we want to change the structure of power in society and the structure of bargaining power in society, this more equal access to wealth, together with workers' rights in corporation, because I think, you know, we really have to move in both dimensions. It's not just, you know, keeping property rights as they are today and spreading property. It's also transforming the very notion of property and getting to a better balance between the rights of workers, the rights of property owners, the rights of consumers, environmental rights, local government rights. You know, I think you know, we have to go more and more in this direction.
I think you hear often people talk about, you know, exactly what are the drivers that produce such extreme levels of wealth inequality, let's say. How is it that the top 1/10% own almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%? How did they arrive at that place? And sometimes you hear people just say, well, we need to tax the people at the very top and then we can, you know, spend to lift the incomes and increase prosperity for those in the middle and down at the bottom. But other times you hear people say, instead of chasing that wealth on the back end, once it's been accumulated by the people at the very top, we need to start thinking more seriously about pre-distribution so that it's not just about Robin Hood and redistributive policies, but pre-distribution. And that, it seems to me, is what you were just getting at when you talked about property rights, different worker arrangements, ownership arrangements. You mentioned earlier intellectual property. So I wondered if you might say a little bit about pre-distributive policies and the ways in which that could help also attenuate the degree of income and wealth inequality.
Right. So as you just said, the important part I'm trying to make about pre-distribution is that it has to come together with a lot of progressive taxation of wealth and income. And sometime in the past, you know, this term of pre-distribution was used not by everybody, but by some people as a way to say, okay, we don't need progressive taxation, very progressive taxation anymore. We should only care about pre-distribution. But in fact, you need both at the same time. With the example I gave, it's clear that if you want to have this system of universal capital endowment, which I'm proposing, you need to have this progressive tax on wealth and inheritance to pay for it. So, by the way, just to give you the numbers in the proposal I'm making in the book, the idea would be that everybody would inherit from at least, as I was saying, 100, or in my example, 120,000 euros, which would be more, $150,000. So people who today receive zero would receive that much. And in order to pay for that, people who today receive $1 million or euro would receive only 600. Which will still leave a lot of inequality between children, as you can see. And if you want my opinion, I think we could go further than that. So I think what I'm pushing forward is not radical at all. It's just trying to be consistent about the notion of equal opportunity. But if you want to go in this direction, which is already, again, it's not at all full equality of opportunity. It's just moving in this direction and trying to address this sort of extreme poverty in terms of wealth of the bottom 50%. In order to pay for this capital endowment of 120,000 euros at age 25, you need pretty steep progressive taxation of wealth and inheritance. And it is the same through other mechanisms for income. So one way to fight for a very extreme top executive compensation is also to have a very high and quasi-confiscatory tax rate above a certain level of executive compensation. And this was used in the past, basically between the 1930s and 1970s, and this worked pretty well. Now, that's never sufficient. We also need to act at the same time on the legal system. So typically, more workers' controls in corporate boards is also useful at the same time. So we don't want to choose between progressive taxation and more labor rights. We want to move in the same direction, and I think pre-distribution, more equal distribution of power in society will follow largely from this. The other main instrument is, of course, education. And so I show in my book, how much hypocrisy there is today about the notion of equal opportunity in education and meritocracy. In practice, if you look at parental income and access to higher education in the US, it's particularly extreme, but it's pretty bad in Europe too. Your parental income has a huge predictive power on access to higher education. So here, I think it's important to set targets and verifiable targets. It's not enough to say, oh, we are in favor of equal opportunity and blah blah blah. And, it's just, these are just words. Okay, everybody's in favor, but in practice, that's not at all what we see. So we need to have verifiable targets. We need to have quantitative targets. It is the same problem. It is the general problem of economic justice has to be formalized. If in terms of taxation, before the invention of progressive taxation, tax system, a long time ago, many centuries ago, were just based on sort of local negotiation between, the elite and the people who were just distributing the tax burden the way they want. And there was then the invention of a notion like income or capital or inheritance with brackets of tax rates, which don't work perfectly well, but at least allow us to have a democratic conversation about, what's the right level. And now that's what's missing with the allocation of educational resources, which until the present day, is extremely unequal and at the same time impossible to verify and to set as a political target and a matter of political mobilization.
So there are a lot of ideologies, economic and political ideologies. Is there one that you consider the most pernicious?
Well, what's peculiar about today's ideology and today's system of inequality is probably the notion of meritocracy. What's very special today is that we pretend that, you know, the winners of the system have more merit than the losers. And, you know, of course, that's putting a lot of pressures on the losers, because that's basically saying not only you're poor, but in addition, that's your fault. And, you know, you don't have enough merit, you don't have enough diligence, you didn't put enough effort, etc., etc. Now, this kind of ideology, you know, you see it in every society. Of course, in every society, elites tend to exploit that they have more merit than the rest. You know, what would they say otherwise? But I think today it has become particularly important, especially with the rise of higher education and the rise of education in general. And there's one book which called The Rise of the Meritocracy, written by a British sociologist called Michael Young, which he wrote in 1958. And at the time, he wrote it as it's like a science fiction story where he's trying to anticipate the future. And at the time, he's actually trying to warn his friends from the Labour Party in Britain in order to tell them, well, look, if you don't take seriously the objective of having a more equal educational system and less educational stratification, you know, you're going to end up with so much inequality and so much violence in the ideology of inequality, especially among the lowest group in society, which will be more and more described basically as useless and meritless, and etc. And so his concrete prediction is that around 2000 or 1990, I don't know. I mean, he writes in 1958. His prediction is that there will be a split in the Labour Party in Britain, which will split between the Technicians' Party, which will be sort of the upper skill group, and the Populist Party, which will end up in a complete bloody revolution by about 2020, where the sociologist, journalist who writes the book ends up being killed in the middle of a riot, and this is the end of the book. And for all those of you who have not read this book, you know, that's called The Rise of the Meritocracy, published in 1958 by Michael Young. You know, I think it's a very funny book, by the way, and I think it's quite deep, because what happened since 1958, well, it's not exactly what Michael Young predicted, but to some extent, well, if I look at the political affiliation of the different groups, you know, it has become even worse than what Michael Young predicted, in the sense that in his view, the Conservative Party in Britain would remain the party of the educated elite. What we see in practice is that, in fact, among the university graduates, the Labour Party is now doing better than the Conservative, like the Democratic Party is doing better than the Republican in the US. So I think this rise of higher education and meritocratic ideology, without any serious attempt to look at whether we have real equal opportunity or not, that's a problem. Because, you know, of course, we are all, we can all agree that merit can be good than the lack of better than the lack of merit. But, you know, the problem is that this is used as a pure ideology to justify huge privileges which cannot be justified. And I think if we don't take more seriously this issue of educational justice, you know, we will not be able to change this complete reaffiliation, disaffiliation that we've seen over the past 60 years. And again, this is why the proposals that were made during this campaign by a number of candidates, again, typically Warren and Sanders, about putting an end to student debt or to personal debt in general, about having more investment in public universities, you know, are so important.
So I love that was your answer, because I anticipated that was going to be your answer. And it is so pernicious, the idea that it's so complicated for people to tell, you know, why did someone become so extraordinarily wealthy? How did that happen? Because you can't see, I mean, it isn't easy for everybody to see the patent laws and protections of intellectual property, the trade laws, the tax laws, the labor, all of the things that allow, if you like, the very, very rich to, in a sense, take more than their fair share over a period of decades. And so when people come along like you and you say, you know, we ought to think about a wealth tax, or we ought to think about more progressive taxation, and people say, wait a minute, that's punishing success. These people, right? And this is what you've just said, that the perception is that people who have done extraordinarily well have done so because they worked really hard to get where they are. They've taken advantage of the opportunities that were available, but anybody could have done that, right? And so my question to you is, and this is a question that came up and was posed to some of the presidential candidates in the Democratic Party, and it's a thorny question and it gets people in trouble. But I'm going to pose it to you, and feel free to dance around it. Should billionaires exist?
Well, you know, in the ideal tax system that I described, in effect, billionaires will not remain billionaire very long. So you could become billionaire for a couple of years, you know, if you are incredibly successful with a particular service, or, you know, if someone sells a book, you know, 5 billion copy, or, you know, if someone is extremely successful, you know, but this will not last for very long, because the tax system at the level of billionaire will be, you know, very large, say 90%. So in effect, it will bring billionaire back toward, not toward full equality, but toward levels of wealth more like 10 million or 5 million or 20 million, you know, this kind of level. And even at this level, you know, there will be a pretty big mobility. So to summarize, you know, what I want is not a society with full equality of wealth, but instead of having a society where, you know, half of the population has zero or close to zero, and some people have dozens of billions, I would like a society where everybody can have a few 100,000, and some people can have a few million. Some people would even go toward, you know, a few dozen million, but that will not last for very long. So this is still a lot of inequality. You know, this is still enormous inequality. But you will have, well, first you will have very large inheritance tax on large wealth, and also, you know, inheritance tax is not enough. That sometimes the things that people don't realize, that we live in societies where, you know, we have very long life expectancy. You're not going to wait for Mark Zuckerberg to turn 80 or 90-year-old before he starts contributing to the, you know, to the public finances of this country and the world. And let me be clear that, you know, some of these people, you know, certainly they have done useful things, and, you know, I'm not asking for complete equality, but, you know, wealth creation and property accumulation is always social in its origin. It's always collective in its origin. You know, Bill Gates did not invent the computer by himself. You know, he relied on the invention and contribution of thousands of computer scientists who didn't put, you know, their paycheck at the bottom of all of the research articles that they published. And, you know, everybody relies on others, and everybody relies on the accumulation of knowledge that has taken place for the past centuries and millennia. And on natural resources, which, as we know, we have to be very careful on how we use them. So, you know, this all comes from a collective process. And the notion that, you know, economists have invented of, you know, your marginal product, which measures exactly your contribution, it makes no sense. If you think a little bit about it, you know, we all relied on this big pile of knowledge, and this is our main asset, and this is collective. So private property has been invented by societies in order to coordinate individual actions, and to the extent that it is useful for the common good. And I think private property can be useful to coordinate individual action for the common good, as long as it is regulated so that it remains of reasonable magnitude. And so that's the whole thing. You know, the idea that there's a natural right to you know, to property, you know, has made huge mistakes in history. You know, I mentioned some of them with slavery and colonialism, but the kind of appropriation of natural resources that we have with Russian oligarchs today, or with US oligarchs with public knowledge, you know, which in some cases, you know, there's so much public money that is now being privately appropriated by through books or patents. And you know, we see patents everywhere today, except in productivity growth statistics. You know, the growth rate of the US economy has been divided by 2 after the Reagan decade. You know, between 1990 and 2020, it has been only 1.1%, you know, national income per capita growth in this country. It was 2.2% between 1950 and 1990. And also about 2% between 1910 and 1950, and also about 2% 1870 to 1990, which were eras, you know, especially 1950 to 1990, with more equality, more educational investment. So, you know, you've had more billionaires you've had a division by 2 of the top income tax rate, but you know the promise by Reagan was, well, this will boost innovation and growth so that the incomes of all Americans are going to grow like you have never seen. Okay, this could have been right, but you know, 30 years later, the growth rate has been divided by 2. So at some point, I think we have to think again. And I think the reason for this reduction of growth, well, there are many reasons. You know, maybe the gradual end of energy, you know, it could be part of the reason, and the rise of energy prices. But I don't think that's going to be the only reason. I think the main reason is probably the stagnation of educational investment. You know, the US used to be an educational leader. In the middle of the 20th century, you had 90% of a generation going to high school at a time where in Europe and in Japan it was 20 to 30%. So the US was a huge educational leader and in some way more equal in its educational expansion than everywhere else in the world. This has ceased to be the case in the 1980s, and this has been replaced by an ideology according to which, you know, the pursuit of more and more inequality and wealth concentration is going to bring progress, and we're still there with this ideology of billionaires which are never rich enough, and which, you know, if anybody says something bad about them, you must be, you know, archaic and stupid. But, you know, I think this is changing, because at some point the facts, you know, in particular the growth slowdown is quite apparent. But you know, this is not the end of history.
Well, I was going to bring up one question. Did you want me to stop, or do you want me to go to one question from online?
I'm okay, but I'm looking at the organizer. Yeah.
I'm waiting to hear from her. Oh, we can't hear you. I can't hear you. You're muted. Tomas, she can't speak, so I'm going to ask you very quickly, because I know you can do this question quickly. There's a question from Shauna, and Shauna asks, yep, if a student of economics wanted to understand your research better, what would you recommend that they take a look at that's publicly available content? And also, what other researchers should they be paying attention to if they are interested in inequality?
Well, I would simply suggest to begin with to read my book. So is this entirely publicly available? Well, I don't know, but at least there's a lot of material. You know, all the statistical material, all the graph, all the figures are available online. I have also put online very detailed presentation slides of my book, and also of a class that I was actually supposed to give at New York University this spring. So this was supposed to be 8 times 3 hours or 2 hours 30 class on the you know, called Inequality Regime Global History. So there is like several hundred pages of slides which you can have a look at and get a better sense. I also give in these slides and in my book, if you can access it and if you read it, lots of references to work by other social scientists, economic historians, you know, work by Ken Pomeranz on the history of globalization, work on India, work on you know, many parts of the world on which I have not worked directly, and you know, this will provide you some you know, a lot of time. You know, we have a lot of time for reading during the lockdown, so you know, you will find a lot to read there.
Thank you. I think I don't know if Heidi is able, if she's having difficulties or if she's coming back in, but I think she was probably trying to show up to thank you and to say that we are out of time. And if she doesn't jump back on, then I'll assume maybe she's having some difficulty, and I will thank you, and I will say to everyone, you're in this chat, which means you've already purchased the book. So
thank you a lot, Stephanie, for this conversation, and I hope we have resolved the situation. I'm looking forward to see your next book that's coming soon. And you know, I think monetary policy, which we've not talked a lot about, is part of the solution of what we're talking about, and you know, your book on the debt, the myth of debt. So that, yeah, I think is going to be very, very important all these discussions. So thanks for.
Thank you. You continue to do incredible work. So it was very, very nice to be able to join you for this. And I hope we will find ourselves traveling again one day, and maybe we will meet in person.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.